Okay, so once again, welcome everyone. Let's go ahead and get started. We always like to start off with a land acknowledgement. And again, those of you who are just joining, my name is Danny Diaz. I'm the director of the UCLA History Geography Project. And in a minute, we're going to introduce ourselves to you all. But first, okay, Jen, I see that. I'll see what I can do about it. First, we just want to take a moment to acknowledge that we are on UCLA History Geography Project and UCLA are on Tongva Gabrielino land. And we want to acknowledge that the Tongva Gabrielino peoples are the traditional caretakers of the unceded land, originally known as Tovangar. I'm joining you all from Whittier, which was known as Shivanga. And the Tovangar Nation was the Los Angeles Basin to the Southern Channel Islands. Those of you who are in here who have students and you want to do land acknowledgements or show your students what Indigenous peoples' land they're on, you can go ahead and use this terrific website that I just linked in the chat. And what you simply do is type in your zip code and it'll show you the Indigenous land that you're on. It's a really great resource. Okay, so introductions. As we're doing this in the chat, if you can just let us know who you are, so name, what you teach, where you teach, and one of your, maybe one hope that you have in terms of a learning outcome for this workshop. And I'll go ahead and start again for those of you who just joined us, and then I'll hand it off to Miguel. My name is Danny Diaz. I am the current director of the UCLA History Geography Project. Our project supports history and ethnic teachers in Southern California. We do that by partnering with districts, and we provide workshops and even curriculum. Before that, I was a history teacher at the high school level, and I did 1 year of 6th grade. I taught at Roosevelt High School in Boyle Heights, and then I taught at El Rancho High School in Pico Rivera. And I also had a nonprofit for about a year and a half that was focused on supporting foster youth in the San Gabriel Valley. All right, so I'm going to hand that off to Miguel.
Hi, my name is Miguel Sandoval. I'm currently an ethnic studies teacher in South Central Los Angeles, specifically Florence Firestone area. This is my 11th year teaching. I taught world history, US history, and APUSH, and now I'm teaching ethnic studies. I come to this work as a person who, wasn't exposed to like any sort of ethnic studies tradition or histories outside of Eurocentric history. And so I've been excited as a teacher, first trying to find ways to incorporate ethnic studies into world history, then US history, and now finally being able to focus on my passion subject, which is ethnic studies. And I hope that whatever you're teaching, you can find the space and the place to incorporate some of these activities, or at least start incorporating conversations about the importance of race, white supremacy, and white settler colonialism in your teaching.
Thank you. And Elizabeth, did you want to introduce yourself as well?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Elizabeth Lester. I'm the executive director of the Asia Pacific Center at UCLA. Our center is co-sponsoring this workshop and the series of events this week that UCLA and the Asian American Studies Center are co-organizing around the 150th commemoration of the 1871 massacre. So I'm very honored and excited to see so many people here, and hope that you will stay on for the live stream of the musical performance that is happening live downtown starting at 2 p.m. But will be live streamed, and there's a link in there in the agenda and in the chat that we'll put in at the end as well. And also there will be an academic panel on this coming Friday at noon. So that probably conflicts with a lot of your schedules, but it will be recorded. So hope that you will tune in for that at some point as well. We have a wealth of information and resources about this event and the program. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Elizabeth. Well, welcome everybody. And for those of you who just joined us, please in the chat, just let us know your name. Thank you for sharing, John, what you teach, where you teach. We have somebody here from Little Rock, Arkansas, by way of California. Welcome, Jen. And then let us know what you hope to learn from this teacher workshop. It's always helpful for us to get that information from you before we jump into our into what we have planned. That way we can address some of the things that you are talking about. And let's go ahead and talk about some context. So what the way that this workshop is going to work is that I'm going to kind of set up Miguel's lesson. And the way I'm going to do that is by giving you some ideas on how you can lay out this, this topic in a maybe 2 to 3 day lesson for students, just depending on what kind of block you teach in. So if you teach in like a 60-minute block, this might take maybe 3 lessons. If you do like a 90-minute block, one of those longer periods, you could potentially do this in 2 periods. Miguel has more expertise and experience doing this, so he might be able to address that in terms of the planning and how long this takes. But as you all know, when we introduce new topics to students, we always want to provide some historical context. And so we want to provide historical context with a purpose, right? We want our students to know why we're going to be learning about this. And the way that we do that is through a good inquiry question, like the one that Miguel has provided on his lesson, which is what were the causes of the 1871 Chinese massacre in Los Angeles, right? So in order to get there, students sort of need to understand, not with sort of a heavy emphasis on memorization, but they need to understand the context for this 1871 event. Now, I'm going to drop in the chat a link to a terrific article that was written by Cecilia Su, who is a professor, a scholar over at UC Davis. And this article is very informative for teachers. And also, I think it's something that might be able to be shared with students, especially if your students are at the secondary level. So what I wanted you to do is click on that link that's in the chat. It's also on your agenda. And read over the first 4 pages. And so I'm going to give you about, let's say about 8 minutes to do that. It's a quick read. Read over the first 4 pages. And I want you to reply in 8 minutes with something that you learned. And then thinking about how you might use this article with students. Okay, so again, something that you learned, maybe that you did not know prior to reading Cecilia Su's piece in the source, and how you might use this article with your students. So might you have any questions about this, what we're doing for the next 8 minutes? It should take us to about 1:20 or so. Okay, so I think I did my good teacher pause. It doesn't seem like we have any questions. So at this point, you can go ahead and shut your video off. I'll check in with you all at 1:20. And we'll have a conversation about what we learned and how we could use this article with students. All right, everyone, just checking back in. Hopefully you all had a chance to finish the 4 pages. You'll also notice that there was a really great timeline at the end. So if you could, maybe in the chat, just something that you learned. And then if you want to unmute anybody and just let us know how you could use this article with your students. I think we have time for maybe 1 or 2 people to share how they might use this in their classroom. So in the chat, something that you learned from Professor Su, and then unmute and tell us how you might use this with students. Thank you, Sandra.
All the programs we offer are free. And 99%.
Having some mic issues, but yes, go ahead. Okay. That's to be expected in our new Zoom reality, right? We have audio and tech issues. Thank you for trying to share. We appreciate that.
Danny, if I could, I guess I'll just share.
Yeah, go ahead, John.
Real quickly here. What I found really, a couple of things I thought it was eye-opening, I guess, in a sense. I mean, since I teach California history, I mean, I do have some familiarity with the 1871 massacre, but I didn't realize that there was even a bigger massacre there in Wyoming in 1885. But what was really informative, and I think oftentimes what we don't necessarily realize, at least when we teach history, that sometimes that even economic issues, tend to bring out some racial matters, and I think that's just part one of the most crucial lessons in terms of how the economy itself will unfortunately will raise a lot of racial issues. So for the Chinese, of course, with the Mexican experience in the 1930s, but how time and time again, even in the 1980s, the incident there in Detroit, so that for students to be able to understand that that racism itself is not necessarily just some sort of social factor, that even economic factors do play a role, and even political. And of course, I think something that was really crucial that in the article, and of course, in the last presidency, and of course, all those, once again, those racial sentiments being in a way kind of dare I say, even being accepted, which is unfortunate. And I think for students to realize that it's not acceptable, we start dehumanizing, and I think that's part of the crucial lesson here for students to understand that any of these incidences, whether they're towards Asian Americans, Latinos, Black Americans, to anyone for that matter, gender-wise even, that we're just dehumanizing each other. So I think that was probably one of the key things about this article that really brings to light those key factors.
Thank you, John, for sharing that. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think one of the things that's helpful about the article is that Professor Su provides a framework that we can use as teachers to help our students understand when this kind of anti-Asian racism, when the recipes in society and the economy are there for some of this to happen, right? We talk a lot about continuity and change and cause and consequence in history classrooms. So if you notice her first paragraph, she talks about these 4 overarching points that help us understand why this is continually happening, how it's sort of ingrained in the institutions and laws of the United States, right? This idea of the Asian American being the perpetual foreigner is something that we've heard, or I've read about and heard on podcasts in the wake of the recent anti-AAPI violence. But then it's really, like a lot of you pointed out in the chat, it's really interesting to see when there's a public health crisis and or an economic depression that this stuff yields its head. And I'm guessing that this probably applies, we definitely know it applies to Latinx folks when there's depressions, and it might also apply, this might give us, what I'm saying is this might give us a larger framework to help students understand when we have these like waves of like violent racism in this country. But then the other part that's important is what she says in number 4, which is that at all these points, or a lot of these points, especially more modern history, that there's resistance and activism, right, to this kind of racism. And it's really important for us in our classrooms to talk with our students about race and about resistance to it and activism. All right. So for more about that, I'm going to go ahead and hand this over to Miguel, who's going to walk you through his lesson and talk to you about some ideas he has for teaching this. Go ahead, Miguel.
Thank you. Thank you, Danny. I really appreciate everybody in the chat. And I appreciate knowing also the different levels. You know, I mean, we have people in higher ed, but I did this for an 11th grade classroom. And so I think it's important to note that the way that this lesson was built, it was meant for a high school classroom. However, the rigor is very high in this lesson. And when I taught it, I did note that it was a really difficult lesson for my high schoolers to understand, for the documents specifically, the way that they're written. But looking at folks who are teaching in the community college or just in higher ed, I definitely think a closer look at some of these sources, perhaps longer sources, and you know, allowing students to have more choice in what they decide the causes are, would be a good idea. But anyways, the way I came at this lesson was I was trying to think about, you know, allowing students to come to their own decision about why this event happened. And as a teacher, I was working with the USC archives and historians Dan Lynch and Yesenia Hunter, and I couldn't decide on the reason. And so I think that when it comes to engaging students in a lesson that is important and meaningful to them, I think it's important to also have questions that even you as a facilitator might not know the answer to, because white supremacy in America continues to shift, right? And so when we see in this article, even today, although you know, we see some changes in the language, we don't necessarily see that it's going away, right? So it's not necessarily progressive or getting better. It's just shifting to our time period. And I think students can understand that. And as teachers, it's important to recognize that. So my question is, what were the causes of the anti-Chinese massacre of 1871? And honestly, I don't have an answer. I created some choices and we'll look at those in a second. But the way I started for high school students is looking at a sketch. And I saw in the article, there was another sketch. And so that presents another opportunity or possibly a different sketch to look at. Getting into it with high schoolers, I normally start with basic, what do you see? What do you think? What do you wonder? And so on the next slide, you see that sketch. As I was thinking about the progression of the lesson, I was thinking about how could I engage students in a way that progressed, that didn't jump right into the situation, but at the same time helped them or made them imagine or think about the reasons why something like this would happen in our own city, in Los Angeles, because I teach in Los Angeles. And so my guiding questions around this sketch are, what do you notice about this image? What questions come to mind? What do you think happened? And what's the story that the sketch tells? Now, in my experience, students are able to grasp a lot from a sketch, right? A lot of students in my class brought up the fact that there were children in the background. And so if you look at the kind of, there is a mob, but in the background, there are children. And so in the context of Reconstruction era violence, it's important for us to know that this was a community moment and that in many ways, this was something that was enabled and a part of the creation of Los Angeles, right? This is not something that was outside of the norm. This, in fact, may have been the version of justice that 1871 Los Angeles showed. So I start with the sketch. Definitely my lesson, when I gave it to 11th graders, took 2 block periods. So my periods are 1 hour and 40 minutes. And so when we're talking about a lesson for high schoolers, you're going to need to give them time. And I would even imagine now, if I were to go back and change it, using this article that we just read, I would probably start with that and then jump into this lesson. I also have some notes in the lesson where there's a particular SHEG lesson from the Stanford History Education Group that might be useful in doing prior to this lesson. After going through the sketch and having kids think and wonder, then we get into the reasons why, the possible reasons why. Now, like I was saying, I would probably even consider some of the reasons given in the article as possible reasons. And if you're teaching in higher ed and you know, your students are able to perhaps just make them come up with their own reasons. But for high school, I gave them some options. Could it be that it was just racism? And I think, talking about racism with students, they may have different definitions. And so some of these words you do need to help define. And I'll talk a little bit more about talking about race in your classroom a little later, but you may need to define these words for kids if you're doing at the high school level. Another possible reason, was it this caused by the fighting amongst the Chinese Tongs, which we see in the video, in the Lost LA video, that was the initial spark for some of the violence? Was it revenge for the killing of white men? Because in this incident and many incidents, there is a notion of revenge or of avenging or seeking justice for certain prominent white settlers that may cause some lynchings. Was it xenophobia? And I think when I think about xenophobia, I teach my students that many times it's linked to a sense of rivalry and a sense of fighting over labor. And we see that happening in San Francisco, throughout California, in the era, in the Reconstruction era, or after the gold rush. I asked, is it vigilantism, right? Is it some sort of justice? Like, is the cause the idea that that the only source of justice in Los Angeles in that moment would be a mob? Finally, is it just another example of a theme that we see across the United States of Reconstruction era racial violence in the post-Reconstruction era, trying to create these hierarchies that existed before and recreate them? And we'll see at the end of the lesson, when we look at the lynching map, how maybe students might believe that this is just another example of Reconstruction era violence. So now we're gonna get into the sources. In my lesson plan, I created some text-dependent questions, but I also created a graphic organizer. And I think that I was much more pleased my second year of teaching this lesson in just giving the students the graphic organizer and having them decide what were the reasons and what's the specific evidence and the details and the words that help the students understand what were the underlying reasons. Now, at this point, I do want you to check out one of the sources. And so, Danny, can you drop the Padlet link? So I created a Padlet just for some general resources and materials that I used in creating this lesson and that I would recommend. And so the first thing you'll see is the Lost LA video. And I start with that video. Actually, I'm sorry if I didn't make that clear, but in the lesson progression, we do the sketch. Students watch the video and they watch it as a source. And so I think that an important idea for me as a teacher right now is that videos are sources. And many times our students come in with an ability to be able to grasp concepts simply from watching videos, whatever it may be, whether it's something that's interesting to them or something having to do with history. And so my source A is the actual video. And given the fact that the video comes from the USC archives, it's perfectly fine and rigorous. Now, after the video, I get into the documents B through E. And so in the second column, I want you to click on the Google document and I want you to choose one of the sources. If you're not sure which one to choose, I would recommend source C. The sources, I chose them to go in a chronological order. And so the first source or the first source after the video is document B, which happens only a few days after the lynching. Then it continues in a chronological order all the way to, and I have to give a shout out, I think I see Victor Ju in the participants. The last source is from Victor Ju's book. But right now I want you to choose one of the sources. If you're not sure which one, I would recommend source C. And let's take just 5 minutes to read one of the sources. And I'm gonna ask in the chat, can you add, what do you think was the cause? And maybe some words or details that back up that point. And so once again, I'm gonna repeat it. Please choose one of the sources. I recommend source C. And then we'll take about 5 minutes, and in the chat, please respond with, what do you think, according to the source, might be one of the causes of the massacre? And what are the details or the words that help you understand that?
Looks like we have a response. Some responses. Miguel, do you want me to man the chat or you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I can talk about it a little bit. And thank you, Mr. Fuentes. I see you there. Sandra, it's interesting that you chose that that quote, and I think that when I taught this lesson with my students, many people asked me about, the use of the N-word in that document, why it might be used, and I think that going into that question could be its own lesson, in terms of what were the notions of race and how are those changing as Los Angeles went from being, a town that was maybe mostly Californio, maybe Mexican, like marginally, but then the American hierarchy of racism being applied to a place that had more shifting notions or more like easily shifted notions, and we know that because of Pio Pico, right? And actually, that alley comes directly from the fact that Pio Pico and his family own land there. And I think actually that Pico building, if we were to find the exact place, probably right around the Pico building would be where this massacre happened. All right, so thank you for engaging in that, for taking a second. Yes, and when you look at the sources that are later in the student experience, you'll see that there comes more of the connection to the Reconstruction era violence. But an interesting source that I think is worth checking out and using, no matter what your level of teaching, is the final source that I gave students, and I'm sharing it in the chat. This source is a place where students can look at chronologically and geographically where lynchings happened. And I always save this source for the end, because I want students to not just think about this violence within a particular ethnic group, but to think about the violence within the entire span of white settler colonialism, and who gets attacked. If you look at this, and actually, Danny, do you mind showing that, the map? If you look at this lynching map, and I have students look at it and develop questions about it, then you can see that the violence is not something that is only happening in Los Angeles at the time. I think it's under lesson materials. And I think it brings up some interesting questions for us, which is basically, was this similar or different to the lynching of African Americans in the South or Mexican Americans in Texas? And also looking around California, if you teach in the Bay Area, right, there are other lynchings happening at the same time. And so we saw that in the article in the beginning, but we have to ask the question of, how can we deal and reckon with the reality that some of our spaces, whether your students, no matter the ethnicity of your students, we live in spaces that have been demarcated and created as a result of this racial violence and as a result of white settler colonialism. And so my students are always surprised, and they always, you look for the red here, right? If we're looking particularly at Chinese violence, look for the red spots. And we see it in Los Angeles. We see what happened in Wyoming, that was mentioned in the article, but also places like Eureka, California. I recently saw an article. And so I asked students, is this something that, only applies to anti-Chinese racism? Or is this something that is a larger theme that was happening throughout the time? The answer, of course, is like up to the student. And I really don't, I can't position myself as an expert because I'm not, but I do want to bring the conversation to the students. And that's essentially what we're doing here. So yeah, so that's pretty much the lesson. Students are asked to write a paragraph and give evidence to choose one or two causes um, as to why they think the massacre happened. But there's evidence for almost all of the causes. I really have not been convinced, nor do I, think that I have the answer. I don't. But the question is what matters at the end of the day. And posing these questions to students, I think, is the most critical work that can happen right now. I did want to point out some things for teachers to use in terms of like just talking about race in general in the classroom. And so now that I teach ethnic studies, I know that there will be difficult conversations around race and that students are bringing their prior knowledge, whether it's things that they learned at home or on social media, into the classroom. And so I wanted to point out a resource from the Teaching Hard History podcast. If you've never checked that out, there's a particular episode that I think is worth checking out, and it's called Creating Brave Spaces in Your Classroom. And what it talks about is all the pre-work that happens to talking about race in the classroom, right? Like this lesson cannot be my first lesson wherein I acknowledge that race was important and racial violence was a part of the creation of the United States. You know, if it's my first time, then the lesson is probably not going to go well because there are stereotypes that could be used by students to trigger other students. And so I think about really 4 things. And in this podcast, they go in depth about what are the 4 things, or what are some things that you could do to set up a situation where students feel safe to talk about race. The first thing is respect privacy. I tell my students that we're not necessarily keeping secrets about the class, but also we're not here to call each other out or to create these like gotcha moments with other students. And so respecting privacy and allowing for people to make mistakes, to bring up stereotypes and to be questioned is important in the classroom. The second thing is listen patiently. And that means I don't want kids interrupting each other. I don't want them assuming things. And I want them actually to write down what other students say. In my classroom, it's important for us to get to know each other. Otherwise, when we have the difficult conversation, we could judge each other a lot more easily. The next one is listen actively. And so I ask students to build on each other's conversations, not just try to wait for a person to be quiet to say your part, but to actively engage, write down, and then either build on, question, or agree with somebody else's point. The last thing that I ask students is, oh man, I'm blanking on that right now, but let's see, listen actively, listen patiently. I forgot my last one. But anyways, in the podcast, they talk about a specific book that's worth checking out. And they also talk about these 4 kind of ideas or things to keep in mind. They could be explicit, or sometimes they're implicit by the way that you run your classroom, your routines, or the way that you allow students to engage with each other. Oh, here's the last thing. The last thing is monitor your voice. And I don't think that we really teach that very often. But sometimes I ask students, are you the right person to be talking in this conversation? Yesterday, I had a conversation about why race matters in the classroom after an entire unit. And in one of my classes, I have only 1 Black student. And so in that conversation, the question came up, should Latino students be allowed to use the N-word? That's something that happens, you know, in my community where I work. And in that moment, I asked students to monitor their voice, meaning that you have to ask the question, am I the right person to be responding to this question? And if I'm not, then hold back. And so those 4 ideas, right? Respect privacy, listen patiently, listen actively, and monitor your voice can be 4 avenues or 4 key kind of parameters for students to start talking about race. And I think that building that environment is probably more important. Is probably really important for you to be able to have a quality conversation rather than a conversation that turns into the confirmation of stereotypes, because that could happen. but that's my experience teaching this lesson in the classroom and teaching about race really every day in the ethnic studies classroom. And I find that young people do not have an issue talking about race. I think the people that have the main issue are the adults, right? Because we are uncomfortable and we are worried about what might happen. But when these conversations happen, I find time and time again that students tell me that the class that I teach or that particular class was the most enjoyable, the most engaging, and the one that most relates to what their lives and their experiences now. Yeah, so thank you for letting me share. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions. And thank you to all the people who are doing the research, because I see people in higher ed, people who are teaching this and developing even some of the theories behind it, so that us as teachers, we can go into the classroom and see how they play out.
Thank you, Miguel. All right, folks, we're going to go ahead and conclude this with some conversation about how we can use art as a way to also assess what students learned and tap into some spaces and opportunities for students to also do healing. There's some really terrific emerging, it's not emerging, it's kind of popular now in light of the pandemic. Some really good stuff from Sean Ginwright, talking about the way that we can use art in our classrooms as an opportunity for students of color. His particular research focuses on Black youth, but I would argue all students of color and all students to engage in some healing as well as some assessments. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again and show you potential activity. Whoops, sorry about that. That you can layer into Miguel's lesson. So what you're seeing here is a photo of a student. This is a student from Northern California. And this is a student using Play-Doh to create a monument, a memorial. Right? That's another thing that sort of is the connecting piece here, is there's a lot in the news about memorials and monuments being torn down and new ones being erected, right? So this is an activity that works really well with Miguel's lesson and also has some applicability, because if I'm not mistaken, Elizabeth, you could correct me if I'm wrong, the city of LA is going to put up a monument or some sort of marker commemorating this particular tragic event or this event in this space. So this is something that students can work on, knowing that that folks have been asking for some kind of commemoration or memorial to the victims of this 1871 massacre. So if you look at it, if you have young students, I would, okay, Jen, I see that. I'm sorry about the sign-in sheet, folks. If you can't access it, don't worry about it. If you have young students, I would recommend using like Play-Doh. If you're an elementary school teacher, you can have students use Play-Doh or clay. And I find, and I'm a former high school teacher, that my students loved playing with Play-Doh. I'm a 42-year-old man and I love playing with Play-Doh. So I don't think there's an age restriction, but it's something fun for students. And they get to use their hands, right? And Sean Ginwright talks a lot about creating art pieces that have students explore issues of social justice or discrimination or race, and writing about these things, answering inquiry questions. These are really good strategies. But when you ask them to develop something artistic, a response, a memorial or a monument in this case, they're accessing a part of their brain that isn't often accessed in, unfortunately, in like English and history classrooms. And they are developing something that comes from their heart, right? That comes from their creativity. And in this case, a memorial, right? They're sort of commemorating this. And Sean Ginwright argues that in that process, when we're tapping into those artistic abilities and we're pulling elements from our culture, especially. So if you imagine you have Asian American, Chinese American students in your class and are doing this activity, it's a source of healing for them, right? Of not just like seeing this horrible event and like sort of as victim, but also there's an opportunity for healing through the design and artistic process. So this is a handout that you can go ahead and link to. You can download it. It works sort of like a generic, but it would work perfectly for this particular activity. And then another thing is we always like to do calls to action when applicable. And I'm just letting you all know that the Asian American Justice Institute, I hope I said that right, of Los Angeles is offering bystander intervention trainings on Zoom. I think they're like 45 minutes. And Ken Jeong, the actor, comedian, he has a nice YouTube video here that explains the 5 Ds of bystander intervention. It could be some really good training for you and to show your students, maybe offering them some points if they do it, or just assigning it and teaching them to be like upstanders or, intervening in moments when folks are you be name called, or in this example, this particular training is about elderly Chinese American folks who have oftentimes been the victim of racism and violence, unfortunately. So that's about it. Thank you all so much. I do want to remind you that, whoops, sorry about that, that we have the performance that follows this immediately. So like, it's a really good sort of segue. We're ending talking about the power of art as an opportunity to heal. And you're going to see something similar as these performers, tap into more than just like a practice rehearsal. They're going to be tapping into a lot of their spirit, their culture, their heart, their soul as they do this performance. So I think it's really good, and I hope that all of you are able to join and watch that live stream of that event. Okay, so thank you all so much. If you have any questions, I see that there's problems with links. Feel free to unmute, and I'll do my best to offer. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of your Sunday, and hopefully we see you at the performance.